To begin by telling just a couple of stories. Yesterday I gave this talk at Georgia State. I retired from Georgia State in 2010. I worked there from 1988 to 2010. And the way I came to work at Georgia State is that in 1966, back in the days when they had the draft, a lot of young men opted to go into ROTC and so forth, and so as not to be enlisted men. In 1966, on February 28th of that year, I reported to Fort Benning to go through the infantry school, the 10-week course for infantry lieutenants. And that was the most beautiful time of year to be in Georgia. I had never been to Georgia before then, and having been born and raised in New York City. And I thought it was the most beautiful place in the whole world. In the infantry school, you're outdoors every day, you're running around in the forest and so forth. And later on, I got married. I said to my wife, if I ever get a chance to go back and live in Georgia or retire, I'm going to take it. Well, lo and behold, my academic career continued. I worked at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst many years and at the U of I in Chicago. And I got a call one day in 1988 from a dean at Georgia State, and he asked me to come down and be the chairman of the department. So one thing led to another. I made the trip. My wife is a good sport. She was from Illinois. She said, okay, I'll move to Georgia. We had 5 children, and we made the change. And all my boys are all Georgians now. There you go. And my wife is completely adapted to living in the South, as am I. Yesterday when I gave this talk, my oldest boy lives in Nashville. And he came down, he made a surprise visit. He drove down for the day and he filmed my talk at Georgia State on his camera phone. He ran out of space. So he commissioned me to bring my iPad today, and our friend here, I thank you very much, is now filming. He wants to film my whole talk and put it on the internet, on YouTube. Of course, I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I don't understand all these things, but it sounds like a good idea.
Have a million hits by
that's what's happening, and I thank you very much for volunteering to film this event. I'm going to tell another story as to how I came to write a book on Wilbur Kurtz. I've always admired Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. As you know, she was born in 1900, and she was the granddaughter of two Civil War veterans. On her father's side, her grandfather was an Atlantan, but he fought in the 1st Texas Regiment. And on her mom's side, her ancestor, John Stevens, was in the 9th Georgia Infantry. In my case, I was born in 1940, way, way back then. And my great-grandfather was a Civil War veteran. He was an Irish immigrant who came to the United States in the 1840s. He worked in Boston as a house painter with relatives. In 1861, he was married. He had 2 children. And he was certainly not an abolitionist. He abhorred the abolitionists and everything they stood for. Since they were so selective in their indignation, they were so ticked off about blacks in the South not getting fair treatment, but they couldn't care less about all the Irish Catholic immigrants under their nose in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and New Haven. So he couldn't stand the abolitionists. And as I said, there are double standards. So why did he enroll? Why did he enlist? Thanks to the fact that I have all of his complete Army record from the day he enrolled until the day in 1893 when his widow finally passed away, I have about 175 pages of Army documents from the Defense Department that I got from St. Louis in the 70s before the archives burned down. And so I know that he enrolled in order to get the bounties, $1,000 from the feds and $400 from the state. He enrolled in the 28th Massachusetts Regiment, which is the enlisted men, privates. They were almost all Irish-born. The officers were native Irish Americans or Yankees. They campaigned at first at the Battle of Fort Pulaski, then the Battle of Bird's Island outside Charleston. They went up the James River, and on September 2nd, 1862, in the Battle of Chantilly, just out of Washington, D.C., in a place where, in Fairfax, Virginia, he spent the afternoon. His company was under a clump of trees while the Confederates bombarded them all afternoon. When the artillery fire let up, their commanding officer said, "Okay, guys, here we go. We're going to attack." He attacked, and he got a rubber bullet in his right arm. The war was over for him. They took him to the 12th Street Field Hospital in Alexandria, and by some miracle, he was a house painter by trade, he fought those doctors tooth and nail, and he wouldn't let them take his arm off. How am I going to earn a living? He wouldn't let them take his arm off. They put him on a train, and they sent him back to Boston. No Army doctor around there in Boston can figure out where the heck that bullet was. 2 years later, in 1864, they found a doctor in private practice in Cambridge, Mass, who was able to figure out where the bullet was and took it out. I still have that bullet. I'm the lucky guy who inherited his musket, his ammo case, and the rebel bullet that he was shot with on September 2nd, 1862. It lived in his body for over 2 years. So you can imagine when you compare it to the relics we see around here at the relic sales, it was eaten up a little bit by all the various juices that are circulating around inside his body. So I've always been interested in the Civil War and things related to it. And I have a great admiration for Margaret Mitchell. So how did I come to write this book? Not long after I came here in 1988, I became a member of the Civil War Roundtable of Atlanta. All you folks are familiar with that organization. And in 1993, we were meeting right here at Ansley in a big dining room, and the gentleman who was the speaker that night said, "I have a woman from Wachovia Bank who's here, and she'd just like to make a statement before we begin." So she got up on the podium and she said, "We have 2 paintings that are owned by the bank that have to do with the Civil War era, and we're looking to sell them. If anybody is interested in a painting by Wilbur Kurtz, you just have to call me. Here's my phone number," and so forth. Well, I kept my mouth closed. I said nothing, but as she was exiting the room, I followed her. I tapped her on the shoulder, and I said, "I'd be happy to buy these 2 paintings. They're quite large. They're about 7 feet by 4.5 feet. They had hung in banks. They were originally painted in 1933 and 1942 for the First National Bank of Atlanta. One on Forsyth Street and another on Peachtree Street. And at that time, in 1993, the North Carolina banks were coming into Georgia and buying up all the smaller Atlanta banks. The 3 of them, Wachovia, First Union, and Nations Bank. Well, these banks didn't know what to do with these paintings. They had no idea what they were, what they signified, and they were remodeling the building, so they wanted to sell them. So I said to her, "How much are you asking for these 2 paintings?" She gave me a number. I thought I could afford that. So I said, "I can pay that." She said, "Fine." We shook on that, and she said, "Just call me tomorrow at work, and we'll arrange for you to go over to the warehouse and pick them up." I thought, "Oh, this is great." So at the time, I was chairman of the department. I was in there at 8 o'clock the next morning, and there was already a phone call for me. She was on the phone. She was over at 191 Peachtree, which is the richest building at that time. She said, "I've got a problem." That many of the men went home last night, and they happened to talk about Wilbur Kurtz, and some art dealers and others found out about it, and I've been offered much more, several times what we shook on last night, although the figure she had given me was based on an appraisal done by a Buckhead art dealer. So she said to me, "But we shook on that last night." I thought, that is so Southern, that honor. You know, we had a verbal agreement last night. This could not have taken place in New York or Boston, forget it. So she said to me, we had that deal last night, and so my boss is asking you to come up with the money. So I said, "Okay, I'll come over and see you this afternoon." She said he wants it right now before he calls back. I live in the city of Decatur. I went over, I had my car with me that day, went over to the parking garage. I got my unicycle, and I went home and got my car as fast as I could, and I was able to complete the deal with her and then take possession of these 2 paintings, which I've had in my home now for about 20 years, and one of which is now on exhibit at the Wilbur Kurtz exhibit in Marietta, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. So that's how I came to write the book on Wilbur Kurtz, having these 2 paintings in my home for all these years, the last 20 years. On the cover of the book, we see the governor's mansion, Milledgeville. 2 versions of it. This is the original version of Governor's Mansion, Milledgeville. Kurtz started painting it in 1938. He was working for the federal government under one of the Roosevelt plans. And he started the painting because the supervisor said to him, well, this is the centenary of the Governor's Mansion in Milledgeville. Why don't you make a painting of it? So he started work on that in 1938. Then other things were happening in his life. As he had hoped, a contract came through from David O. Selznick in Hollywood, and he shipped out. He went to Hollywood to work on the movie for the next year until December 1939. So he left the painting at home in his studio. He went to California around Thanksgiving time. His wife joined him at Christmas Day, on Christmas Day, a month later, and they stayed there in Hollywood for a year, both working on, as advisors on Gone with the Wind. After he got there, he said to himself, I want to finish that painting. The painting was unfinished. It was still at home in Atlanta. He wrote to his son, asked his son to pack it up and send it out to California. Selznick rents a private estate area called Busch Gardens. It was a fancy residential area where people had large homes, but there was a large wooded area that belonged to all the shareholders in these mansions called Busch Gardens. And Selznick rented it for 2 days to film the barbecue scene. So Kurtz is right there watching these scenes being filmed. And the barbecue scene ends with news coming from Charleston about the shots fired there, and Ansley getting on his horse and riding off to Virginia. A light bulb went off in Kurtz's mind. He said to himself, that's it. And so he painted Ansley and Melanie into his painting. Until that time, he just had the Governor's Mansion. He decided to paint Ansley and Melanie into the painting. After he got it done, the 1st of April, he shipped it back to the governor of Governor Rivers in Atlanta. The press got wind of it, and it became the Gone with the Wind painting. It's been exhibited in the Governor's Mansion ever since. It's prominently exhibited. Last December 2013, this book was finished.